What if the dinosaurs never went extinct? No extinction, no new beginning, just a world that kept moving in the same direction for millions more years. A world where something else stayed in charge. Not better, not worse, just different. And that difference changed everything. So dim the light, get comfortable, and let's see what would have happened if the giants had never left. 66 million years ago, the sky changed. For a moment, it looked like the end. A massive object approached the Earth, hot, fast, ancient. But something shifted. A slight deflection in space, a minor gravitational nudge, or a fragment that broke just enough. Whatever it was, the asteroid never struck. It passed by in silence, trailing light across the heavens, burning in the atmosphere but not touching ground. There was no impact, no flash of death, no crater deep enough to erase a world. Instead, the sky dimmed for days. Dust, ash, and vapor danced across the upper atmosphere, dimming sunlight, cooling winds, and confusing the rhythms of life below. But it was not enough. Not enough to kill the giants. Not enough to open space for something new. When the skies cleared, the earth was bruised, but not broken. The forests were scorched in places, but still standing. And beneath the canopies, the titans began to move again. They were thinner, perhaps, hungrier. The cooling shifted rain patterns, brought early frosts in places not used to them. Some plants died, others thrived, and the herbivores followed the food wherever it led. The predators followed them in turn. The great reptiles, with their jaws and claws and the weight of history behind them, did not fade into extinction. They adapted. Some lost mass, others gained feathers. Some changed their nesting patterns. Eggs were buried deeper, guarded longer. Instincts sharpened. Senses grew keener. Species that once ruled the inland seas disappeared, while others found new homes along rivers and coastlines. Every small change layered upon the last, and across generations, the survivors reshaped their world. They did not inherit a new Earth. They maintained the old one and made it theirs again. But the balance shifted subtly. The mammals, once destined to rise, were pushed back further. They remained small, hidden, fearful. Without the mass extinction to clear the field, they never had their moment. No great explosion of forms, no rise of primates. The night remained theirs, and the underbrush, and the spaces between the footfalls of giants. They were not gone, but they were forgotten. The earth became louder, heavier, and more ancient in its rhythm. There was no future in sight, only the repetition of cycles that had lasted for millions of years already. Life did not restart. It continued along the same track, worn deep by claw and bone and scale, and that track led nowhere new. The world grew quiet again, not from absence but from dominance. There was no challenge left. The dinosaurs ruled not just by strength, but by familiarity. Their systems worked, their instincts served. Evolution still occurred, but slowly, cautiously. Nothing rushed forward. No fire was stolen. No language was born. Intelligence, if it ever existed in the blood of the mammals, remained unused, unshaped. There was no reason to rise, no space to grow. The world had already chosen its kings, and kings do not abdicate for shadows. 50 million years ago, The earth breathed deeply again. The skies had long cleared, the vegetation returned to full flourish, and the great cycles of climate settled into a warm, stable rhythm. Jungles stretched across continents, from pole to pole in some places, thick and damp and endless. And in this green ocean of heat and shadow, the giants moved without opposition. Their feet pressed new paths into the mud. Their tails dragged trenches through the undergrowth, and their hunger carved the land into patterns of pursuit and survival. No walls stood to stop them. No flame pushed them back. They fed, bred, roamed, and remembered only the weight of instinct. They were not the same creatures who had ruled 60 million years before. Their shapes had changed. More feathers, more color, finer hearing, quicker reflexes. But their power remained untouched. In the absence of extinction, they had not faded. They had refined. And the world, still vast and unchallenged, accepted them as it always had. Below them, among roots and rot, lived the ones who might have been. The mammals. They did not vanish, but they never emerged. They remained where they had always been, in tunnels, in trees, beneath stones, under moonlight. Their eyes adjusted to darkness. Their paws grew silent. Their lives were quick, nervous, and forgettable. Some resembled rodents, others gliders, some no larger than beetles. None dared to walk openly in daylight. None stood on 2 feet. None dreamed. The jungles did not welcome them. Every open space was owned. Every scent trail led to danger. Their young were hidden in hollow logs and abandoned nests. Their elders died without markers. They lived between moments, between footfalls, between breaths of creatures that did not know their names. And so, generation after generation, they endured. But they did not change. The planet itself favored the giants. Warmth fed the plants, and plants fed the bodies that carried thunder in their steps. Rain came regularly, storms fed the rivers, and nothing stopped growing. Even the oceans teemed with reptilian life, massive swimmers with jaws wide as boats, long-necked grazers that combed kelp forests like cattle across the sea. On land, the forests never cleared. There were no savannas, no open fields for eyes to scan and minds to sharpen. Only the closeness of green, the thickness of air, the noise of wings and roars and rustling leaves. And within that crowded living machine, there was no room for thought. Only reaction. Only survival. The kind that repeats itself perfectly, endlessly, until the sky decides otherwise. Intelligence, in its early glimmers, still flickered faintly in some corners of life. A bird-like predator began to observe patterns in migration. A marine reptile learned to herd fish. A small, burrowing mammal noticed the changing of the wind and stayed hidden. But nothing advanced beyond instinct. No spark caught. There was no niche left to explore, no sudden pressure that required innovation. The world had reached a kind of perfection, ecological, brutal, ancient. Every creature had its place, and every place was already filled. The mammals waited in silence, not for their time to come, but simply because they had nowhere else to go. The giants moved above them, unhurried, unquestioned, and the earth turned, warmed by a sun that saw no reason to change the story. 30 million years ago, the world grew sharper. The forests were still thick, the air still warm, and the giants still ruled. But not all of them ruled in the same way. Some had grown faster, leaner, more responsive. Claws became more precise. Eyes adjusted better to shifting light. Feathers, once rare, once soft traces of insulation, became common among the smaller predators. At first, they merely helped with warmth in cooler mornings, or in the dim canopy where sunlight barely reached. But then feathers grew longer, changed color, served new purposes. They became tools of display, of intimidation, of subtle communication. Some were striped, others flared bright with iridescence. In a world still ruled by strength, these new forms of signaling gave their users a quiet advantage. Territory could now be claimed not just with blood, but with posture and shimmer and silence. Evolution had not slowed, it had chosen a new path. Hunting changed too. The slow ambush gave way to tactics. Some creatures worked in pairs, circling their prey. Others waited for patterns, when herds drank, when mothers rested, when the ground was soft enough to sink a foot. Teeth still tore, but with planning now. Jaws snapped with timing. A few predators began to train their young, not just protect them. Gestures passed down from parent to offspring. Warnings, signs, even strategy. Nothing like language, but more than reflex. One species used stones to crack open nests. Another learned to mimic the calls of wounded prey. Intelligence remained small, contained within instinct, but instinct itself was shifting. It became layered, more flexible, less bound to the moment. Brains expanded by fractions. Memories lasted longer. The hunt was no longer just hunger. It was opportunity, patience, advantage. And so the balance of power shifted again, not to new rulers, but to more efficient ones. The old, slow giants continued their endless migrations, grazing in thick herds, unaware of the subtle change around them. But in the underbrush, among the ferns and vines, new shapes moved, lighter, quicker, curious. They were not weaker, they were less visible. Feathers gave them heat, speed, lift. Hollow bones made them silent. In time, some left the ground entirely, not in great flocks like birds, but in bursts, from tree to tree, from hill to hill. The sky, once the realm of winged reptiles, now held newcomers, descendants of hunters, decorated in plumes and sharp eyes. They did not replace the old flyers. They adapted around them. The air grew more crowded, but it did not belong to any one form. It became another battlefield of survival, ruled by reaction and refined by need. Beneath it all, the mammals still crept. They felt the shift, but could not follow it. Feathers were not theirs. Strategy came slowly. Their bodies remained soft, quiet, vulnerable. Where the reptiles branched outward into possibility, the mammals dug inward into caution. They grew better at hiding, better at sleeping through danger, better at waiting. But no new fire lit their path. They heard the footsteps above them, the rustle of wings, the shriek of competition, and they stayed still. The gap between them and the world around them widened. The giants adapted. The mammals endured. And the earth, once again, seemed settled, not stagnant, not static, but confident in its hierarchy. The age of dominance had simply learned to walk with quieter feet, sharper minds, and brighter feathers. The throne had not changed hands. It had simply evolved. 20 million years ago, the world was still loud with the movement of giants. The forests thrived, dense and dripping, layered with the calls of feathered predators and the slow, steady presence of massive herbivores. The skies above remained restless, wings crossing in silence or in shrieking pursuit, while the earth below trembled with the weight of lives too large to ignore. In that crowded, layered world, there was little room left for the small, and so the mammals went downward. They did not rise. They did not compete. They retreated beneath roots and stone, carving out silence where there was none above. Tunnels multiplied, connecting nests, dens, shelters, some only a few inches across, others deep enough to hide entire generations. Darkness became their climate. Stillness became their survival. They lived in cool earth and damp hollows, where the tremor of approaching steps could be felt long before it became fatal. Their world was not built for conquest. It was built for hiding. Their eyes grew larger to catch what little light filtered through cracks. Their ears became more sensitive, able to hear the faint rustle of danger above ground. Fur adapted to soil and stone. Claws shifted from climbing to digging. Teeth found new purposes, chewing roots, cracking shells, grooming kin. Some species communicated with scent, others with touch, still others with low-frequency pulses that barely stirred the air. None of them roared. None of them ran in herds under the open sky. They survived by avoiding notice. They learned the seasons not by watching the sun, but by feeling the change in soil. Rain meant floods. Heat meant predators resting in shade. Cold meant collapse. Everything was felt, not seen. They knew their world by vibration and breath. There were no large primates, no apes, no monkeys, no ancestors waiting to rise. The conditions that might have shaped them, wide plains, climbing trees, seasonal challenges, did not exist. The forests were too full. The ground was too dangerous. The trees were not for swinging, but for hiding. The mammals that might have grown larger were caught, torn, consumed before they reached even the size of a fox. There was no margin for error, no second chances. Any lineage that stretched too far upward was cut short. Evolution did not reward curiosity, it punished it. Intelligence remained shallow and instinctual. No one shaped tools, no one passed down stories. Learning happened by watching, in silence, and ended with every new predator's return. Progress was measured not in leaps, but in smaller bones buried deeper underground. And so the mammals became ghosts in their own world. They spread far and wide, but never upward. From one continent to another, they traced invisible lines beneath the surface. They lived under the claws of creatures that would never know they were there. Their numbers grew slowly and cautiously. Their diversity expanded, but always within narrow bounds. Some became better diggers, others better swimmers, a few capable of gliding short distances in the night air, but none broke through. None changed the story. The age still belonged to the reptiles. The mammals had no ambitions left, only habits, only survival. And for millions of years more, that was all they would have. 10 million years ago, something shifted, quietly, cautiously, far from where the thunder still walked. In a narrow band of dense, mist-wrapped forest high in the eastern ridges of what would one day be a continent, a new kind of creature took its first upright steps. It did not roar or stamp or fly. It did not shine with scales or feathers. It had no claws worth fearing, no armor worth noticing. Its strength was not in its body, but in how it observed. These early humanoid forms were small, barely larger than modern primates, covered in coarse fur and perpetually hunched. Their eyes faced forward. Their hands, delicate and tentative, began to explore not just what was in front of them, but what it could be used for. They broke twigs not by accident, but on purpose. They used leaves to scoop, stones to crack, their own silence as a shield. But they did all of this in hiding. They lived in places where even the light came slowly. Deep valleys, cloud-choked hillsides, forgotten groves hemmed in by cliffs. The giants didn't roam there, not often. The land was too narrow, too unstable, too poor in the things that drew the massive. But it was rich in shelter. And for these small beings, that was all that mattered. They built nothing. They passed nothing down in words. But their movements began to change. They traveled in groups, not herds. They taught each other where not to step. They marked trees with scratches. They mimicked the sounds of the forest, not to call, but to mask themselves. Their children were raised in darkness, in silence, in breathless anticipation of the morning that might bring death. And yet somehow, they persisted, not because they were strong, but because they were unnoticed. These beings had no fire, no stories, but they had memory. If one was taken, the others did not forget. They remembered the wind that came before it, the shadow, the sound. They did not fight back, but they learned to avoid. Their lives were short, but not empty. Each generation added a layer of behavior, not written, not spoken, but enacted. A ritual of waking, checking, tasting the air, watching the branches. They did not wonder where the stars came from. They wondered how close the danger had crept overnight, and that wonder made them sharper. Fingers grew more precise. Eyes read more detail. Muscles learned to freeze without trembling. Fear was no longer a reaction. It became a way of life, a structure, a discipline, a code. They were not cowards. They were students of survival. The world beyond their groves remained the same, dominated by creatures that still had no reason to change. The giants grazed, hunted, flew, slept, and began again. They were aware only of what moved in front of them. They did not notice what hid beneath leaves or slipped through shadow, and in that ignorance the small ones found room to breathe. They would never dominate, not here, not in this age, but in their corners of the world, something fragile and persistent had begun. They were not destined for greatness, not yet. But they were not the same as those who had come before. They did not belong to the past. They were not reflections of instinct. They were the first outlines of something else, something uncertain, unfinished, and deeply alone. The world did not welcome them, but it had, for now, failed to destroy them, and that was enough. 5 million years ago, the small ones learned something dangerous. In a dry season, in a high valley far from the usual paths of the giants, lightning struck a tree and set the forest edge alight. The flames did not last long. Rain came quickly, as it often did, but in the ash and embers, something stayed. Warmth, light, a flicker that held back the dark. One of them, a female with cracked hands and cautious steps, reached out. Not close, just enough. She learned that dead wood fed the glow, that dry grass made it leap, that stones nearby grew hot, and that heat meant safety from the cold night air. Slowly, carefully, others joined her. They did not dance, they did not worship, but they watched, and they remembered. And for the first time in their long history of hiding, something inside them stirred. Not hunger, not fear. Curiosity. The fire became a ritual, not every night, not too often, only when the winds were calm and the sky clear and the ground dry enough to hold it without smoke. They built no hearths, no circles, just small pits among rocks, hidden from above. The flames were low, the coals covered quickly when they heard wings in the distance or the crack of branches in the dark. Children were taught not to touch, not to speak, not to breathe too loudly near it. It was not celebration, it was permission. To stay a little longer in one place, to cook a root that would otherwise rot the belly, to dry a skin that might have molded underground. But always, the fire meant risk. The light could be seen, the scent could be followed. Once, when the fire was left untended for only a moment, a shadow crossed the edge of their clearing. A predator, reptilian, tall, narrow-eyed, stood still for minutes, watching the flicker. It did not come closer. It did not turn away. It simply stood, then vanished. After that, they grew more careful. The fire grew smaller. They started to move again, further from their grove, deeper into the valleys where smoke would not rise beyond the rocks. But even that did not keep them safe. One evening, a low fog hung over the trees, and the coals from the night before still smoldered beneath a layer of bark. The scent traveled. When they returned, the cave was not empty. The young were gone. The earth was torn. The fire had not protected them. It had exposed them. That night, the oldest among them walked into the woods carrying a branch still glowing at the tip. She did not return, and in the days that followed, they buried the fire as they had once buried the dead, quietly, fully, without a word. It was not forgotten, but it was abandoned. After that, their nights were dark again. They returned to cold meals, to trembling in sleep, to huddling in caves where damp crept into bones. They stopped gathering dry wood. They no longer searched for flint. The memory remained, in gestures, in stories passed between mothers and sons, in drawings scratched onto cave walls that no longer had light to see them. Fire had been theirs, briefly. But it had not been a tool, it had been a signal. And in a world where survival depended on silence, no signal was worth the price. So they let it go. And once more, the giants walked without knowing they had been challenged. The world stayed as it was, and the ones who might have changed it returned to stillness, not because they were weak, but because they understood at last that not everything found is meant to be kept. 2 million years ago, the warmth began to break. The forests thinned in places, the rains shifted, and the cold crept further than it had in eons. The giants, built for damp heat and heavy vegetation, began to withdraw from the northern edges of their range. Not all of them, some adapted, grew thicker hides or migrated longer distances, but they moved slower now, less certain, more deliberate. And in the narrowing spaces they left behind, something unexpected happened. A group of upright mammals, small but fast, emerged in the cold. They did not challenge the old rulers. They did not hunt or build or gather in open light. They watched the great predators finish their meals and moved in afterward. They took what was left, bones, scraps, marrow. They ate quickly, then ran. They knew how long a corpse remained safe before another set of jaws returned. Their survival was not in strength, but in timing. These upright scavengers lived in scattered clusters, never in one place for long. But they were not aimless. They followed the seasons, tracked migrations, and watched the skies. Their homes were dug by hand, simple hollows beneath frozen ground, reinforced with sticks and fur, always temporary, always quiet. When they slept, they curled together for warmth. When they moved in silence. Every sound mattered. Every track was read. Their children were carried, not left. Their dead were buried shallow and quickly. They understood cold. They respected it. It made them faster, sharper, more cautious. Unlike their jungle-bound cousins, they were not trying to disappear. They were trying to move just ahead of death, one day at a time. Their bodies changed. Legs grew longer, feet hardened, hands stayed nimble, used for scraping meat from bone, digging tools from frost, breaking shells open without a sound. Their faces narrowed, their teeth adapted to mixed diets, roots, bugs, flesh, whatever survived the cold with them. They did not speak, but their gestures grew more complex. A glance could mean danger, a tap could mean move. They made use of stone, not to craft, but to break, to open, to smash. When one group found a pile of frozen carcasses left after a flood, they stayed nearby for weeks, rotating shifts, sleeping in shifts, guarding nothing, just staying alive. They had no myths, no fire, but they had purpose, to survive where others could not, in the spaces the giants had abandoned. And though they feared the old predators, they no longer hid from them. They simply moved faster. These creatures did not inherit the earth. They did not claim it. But they found a way to live alongside it, in the places too harsh for comfort, too narrow for giants, too empty for competition. The cold was not a curse, it was a shield. The snow masked their scent. The ice preserved their food. The wind carried sound away instead of toward. Their intelligence was not brilliance, it was endurance. They learned patterns. They passed down knowledge not in words, but in behavior, in habit, in example. And for the first time in millions of years, a group of mammals began to grow not just in number, but in adaptation. They were still prey, still fragile, but they were not running blindly anymore. They knew the weight of the sky. They knew the shape of a dying creature's breath. They knew, better than anything else, that in a world not made for them, their place had to be earned every day. And they earned it. 1 million years ago, they began to shape the world around them, not with force, but with fragments. These upright scavengers, hardened by cold and silence, learned that not everything needed to be sharp to be useful. They did not chip stone. The sound was too loud. The crack of rock against rock carried across snowfields, through empty woods, under open sky. It echoed. It betrayed. Predators listened for sounds like that. Creatures with feathers and long teeth, with yellow eyes and patience, turned toward sudden noise with certainty. So instead, they turned to what the giants had left behind. Bones, scattered across frozen plains, buried shallow in thawing soil, discarded beside nests. The long, hollow limbs of herbivores, the sharp-edged ribs of fallen hunters. They did not strike them together. They scraped, they sawed, they bent, slowly, patiently. Bone did not scream when broken. It whispered. The tools were simple. A femur, worn smooth, could hammer a root from the ground. A shoulder blade, sharpened along the edge with care, could strip sinew from frozen meat. Small, pointed fragments were used to dig, to pry, to gouge insects from bark. Larger splinters became crude levers to lift stones, to nudge open dens, to push aside collapsed snow. The children watched their elders shape these things, not as a lesson, but as a rhythm of life. There were no workshops, no masters, only repetition, necessity, and memory. When a tool broke, it was buried, sometimes in the ground, sometimes in the snow, sometimes in the chest of something that had been chasing them. Tools were not treasures. They were temporary answers to permanent danger. They carried their tools in wraps made of hide or in slings across their shoulders. Some were never far from their hands, used daily, worn to the shape of their fingers, as familiar as breath. Some they shared, some they buried before sleep. Nothing was left exposed. Nothing was left behind. The caves where they rested were marked not by paint, but by patterns of bone along the entrance, symbols not of art, but of warning. A curved rib pointing east meant movement. A cracked skull beside a fire pit meant death had come too close. They did not speak of these things. They understood them. The old among them had no titles, no roles, but they carried the most worn tools. That was enough to follow. They had seen more, survived longer. When they picked up a piece of bone and began to shape it, the others stopped moving. Stone was everywhere, underfoot, in cliffs, beside rivers, but it remained untouched, not because it was unknown, but because it was loud. They had learned that the world listened, that the forest had ears, that the wind carried intention. When a young one once cracked a flint near the mouth of a hill, the echo was enough to send birds flying for miles. Within the hour, a shadow passed overhead. Long wings, a call that was not a scream but a statement. The group left before dusk. They never returned. From then on, stone remained where it lay. Their hands knew its weight. Their eyes recognized its sharpness, but their silence mattered more. Bone broke gently, and if it broke too fast, it could be buried with ease. Their survival depended on being forgettable. Their tools had to match that truth. They crafted not to build, but to remain unseen. And in doing so, they made something close to culture, even if no one would ever call it that. 500,000 years ago, the silence began to fracture. Not loudly, not all at once, but piece by piece, over years, over lifetimes, something inside the upright scavengers began to push against the weight of instinct. They had always gestured, hands raised in warning, fingers curled to signal hunger or danger. But now, breath itself became part of their message. At first, it was nothing more than patterned exhalation, a sharp puff for stop, a slow release for safe, a half hiss, barely audible for wait. The sounds emerged not from the need to speak, but from the need to survive more precisely. When digging near old nests or crossing open snow where scent lingered for days, they could not risk movement. So they whispered, not to share stories, but to say just enough. Enough to warn, enough to guide, enough to stay alive. These early languages were not structured. There were no fixed meanings, no formal grammar, but there was rhythm, repetition, shared breath. Children learned it not in lessons, but by watching lips move in the dark. A click of the tongue became a command to be still. A hum in the throat meant food. Combinations emerged. 3 soft taps followed by a low whistle meant return by night. 2 short exhales and a grunt meant danger above. These sounds changed between groups, between regions, even between families. But within each cluster, a system formed, not invented, not declared, grown like fungus along damp stone, quiet, unnoticed, essential. It moved between generations like muscle memory. No one taught it. Everyone carried it. They used these whispers inside caves, beneath dense canopies, around the dying heat of carefully hidden fires. They did not raise their voices. Not ever. Loudness was a mistake with a price. The world still belonged to predators. Some on the ground, some in the sky, some with eyes that saw through leaves and time. A shout meant attention. Attention meant loss. And so their voices remained soft, barely more than air against teeth. Words, if they could be called that, were shared in the space between heartbeats. Lovers spoke in breath against skin. Elders gave instructions in sighs. Arguments were conducted with posture, never with pitch. Their language was not for stories. It was for function, for urgency, for the passing of understanding before the dark returned. But even in its limits, something changed. With these sounds, they could now refer to the past. They could warn of a place, not just a presence. They could tell a child that danger had once come from a cave, even if it was empty now. They could plan, crudely, briefly, but more than ever before. A group could scatter in a pattern, could regroup at dawn, could agree that if one did not return, the others would move on. Memory expanded. Action became deliberate. And for the first time, knowledge survived without needing to be witnessed. It could be described, carried, protected. They still feared the open, still avoided stone, still crouched in silence when feathers passed above. But now, even in that silence, they were connected, not just by blood, by language, primitive, whispers, but language. And the world, though it remained unchanged, no longer moved through them entirely unseen. Something inside them had begun to name it, and it would not stop. 200,000 years ago, some of them began to climb, not for glory, not for curiosity, but because the ground had become too dangerous. The great predators, scaled, feathered, and armored, still ruled the lowlands. Their trails crisscrossed the riverbanks. Their nests filled the valleys. Their eyes scanned the plains. No sound went unnoticed. No scent lasted long before being traced. And so a few small bands turned toward the heights. The mountains were colder, harsher, less generous, but they were also quieter. The cliffs were too steep for massive bodies, the air too thin for slow, heavy wings. The predators, built for speed and power at lower altitudes, did not follow. These new settlers climbed slowly, winding through frozen passes, sheltering in crevices and caves half filled with ice. They lost members to cold and hunger, but those who remained found something they had never known before: space. The highlands were not empty, but they were tolerable. Smaller predators lurked in the shadows, but nothing like the giants they had fled. Food was scarce, but the seasons were more predictable. With fewer threats, the rhythm of life began to change. These people, still hunched, still cautious, started to stay longer in one place. Caves were returned to, repaired, remembered. Piles of stones marked safe paths, led from one ridge to another. Fires, once a desperate risk, could now be maintained for days, hidden deep in the mountain's belly where the wind couldn't reach. The language they had whispered below became more deliberate here, still quiet, still careful, but less frantic. They had time to listen, to teach, to notice more than just survival. Gestures became more refined. Patterns in speech, true repetition, early structure, took root like lichen clinging to stone. Children born in these heights were different. Their lungs grew deeper, their limbs stronger, their skin thickened against the wind. Their eyes adjusted to white and gray, to the shimmer of sun on snow and the warning colors of mold that grew in the wet rock. They learned to climb before they learned to run. They moved without sound, even across scree. Bones from mountain goats replaced bones from valley scavenging. Meat was harder to find, but their hands grew clever. Traps of woven grass, snares of rock and vine, ambushes from above. These were not warriors. They were still prey. But they were no longer running. The heights gave them a margin, a breath, a sliver of time between one danger and the next. And in that space, something settled. Not peace, but something that felt like it could hold. From above, the world looked different. The endless green below became texture, not prison. Smoke on the horizon meant other bands, not threat. The stars grew clearer. They began to name the constellations, not in words, but in gesture, in shared glances, in stories spoken against the stone at night. The mountains did not make them safe, but they gave them the illusion of distance, of choice, of shape. They still feared the world, but they no longer feared every moment. And that difference, slight as it was, became the seed of permanence. They did not yet build. They did not yet write, but they returned. Year after year, generation after generation, they returned. The mountains became memory. Memory became place. And place, for the first time in their history, became something they could call their own. Not because they had taken it, but because nothing stronger had come to take it back. 100,000 years ago, they began to stack stones, not as monuments, not to mark territory, but to disappear. The first walls were low, uneven, barely wider than the span of their arms. They were built from broken shale, dry branches, hardened mud, whatever didn't make noise when moved. These walls didn't circle villages. They weren't tall enough to stop anything. Their purpose was different. They bent sightlines. They hid shadows. They broke the shape of movement. From a distance, they looked like nothing at all, just another scatter of rock or brush. But behind them, someone could crouch, could sleep, could light a spark of warmth too small to be seen, could whisper without echo. The walls were not there to stop danger. They were there so danger might not notice them in the first place. In the mountains, where the wind carved narrow passes between ridges, some walls followed the contours of the land, guiding the cold air away from the sleeping places. In the valleys below, others mimicked animal dens, built into slopes or covered with moss to smell like the forest itself. They were not fortresses. They were illusions, decoys. If one of them was taken in the night, by tooth, by claw, by talon, the others did not cry out. They simply moved to another wall, another hiding place. Over time, the walls multiplied. No two were the same. Some were small enough for a single person. Others housed a cluster of families. None lasted more than a season. Rain wore them down. Predators marked them. Snow buried them. But while they stood, they gave shape to the silence. Building became part of life, though the word didn't exist. Children carried stones without being told. Elders chose where to place the openings, not to enter, but to crawl out unseen. The knowledge passed without language, just gesture, repetition, example. Hands remembered what mouths could not risk saying. A wall too straight attracted attention. A corner too sharp cast the wrong kind of shadow. Openings were always at angles, never visible from more than a few steps away. They learned which branches masked scent, which grasses muffled footfalls. Some walls had shelves made of woven roots where tools were hidden. Others had no roof at all, only layers of leaves held aloft by angled supports. From above, even a watchful eye would see only brush and earth. That was the point. The less a wall looked like a wall, the more it did its job. These people, descendants of the whispering scavengers, hardened by cold, shaped by flight, did not build to conquer space. They built to fold into it. Their walls were not declarations. They were confessions. Each one said, "We are here, but we don't want you to know that." And for a while it worked. Predators passed by, fooled by the scent of stone and wind. Giant shadows moved along the horizon without turning. The air remained still, and in that stillness, something fragile took hold. Not safety. That never came. But continuity. A place to return to. A rhythm to repeat. A memory to build upon. The walls stood, crumbled, were rebuilt. Each one slightly different. Each one a little better. A quiet architecture for a species that still wasn't allowed to raise its head, but had learned how to survive without being seen. 50,000 years ago, something new emerged. Not from the caves, not from the snow-wrapped ridges or buried riverbeds, but from the deep, slow forests where time itself moved with caution. A creature long thought unchanged began to shift. It was not larger. It did not roar louder or run faster. It was lean, efficient, and quiet. Feathers covered its limbs, but not for flight, only to soften its steps and scatter its heat. Its eyes were forward-facing, its head narrow and still, and when it moved, it did so with intention. This new predator did not hunt by scent alone. It watched. It remembered. It followed not just prey, but patterns, tracks, repetitions, mistakes. It learned where they gathered. It noticed what they left behind. And slowly, too slowly to recognize at first, the hunted began to lose the rhythm they had spent millennia perfecting. The creature was not alone. It spread in small family units, pairs, trios, sometimes more. They communicated with clicks, with posture, with low vibrations carried through the ground. They marked trees not to scare, but to signal. Their nests were high, away from scavengers. Their claws were not only for killing, they could peel, dig, separate. Some say they began to shape tools, not like the bone fragments the humans used, but talon-carved pieces of shell and hardened wood. They did not carry fire. They had no need. Their vision in the dark was near perfect, their hearing precise enough to pick out a heartbeat through the floor of a cone. Where the humans whispered, they simply listened. Where the humans rung, they circled. And when they attacked, they did not scream. They just arrived. At first, the humans didn't understand what had changed. They noticed only the results. A wall torn open with no tracks. A food cache taken, but no scent left behind. A child gone from a sleeping group, though no alarm had been raised. The forests, once silent and familiar, felt heavier. Nights grew longer, not by the moon, but by the fear of movement. Paths were abandoned. Certain caves were never revisited. The bone tools were buried deeper, carried closer. Whispers became shorter, fewer. Some groups moved higher into the rocks, others deeper underground. But the new predator followed. Not everywhere, not always, but just enough. Enough to remind them that survival was no longer quiet. It had become uncertain. They had once learned how to go unseen. Now, someone else had learned how to see. And so the balance shifted again. Not in a single moment, not with a roar or a flood or fire from the sky, but as a slow turning of weight. One intelligence against another, not equal, not yet, but close enough to matter. The humans did not vanish. They were not hunted to the edge, but they were moved, reshaped. Their world became smaller, their habits tighter. They built fewer walls, moved more often, slept in shifts even when no threat had been seen. Knowledge that once passed down through generations began to be lost. Rituals abandoned, paths forgotten, signs misread. The giants had ruled with strength. The cold had ruled with silence. But this new presence ruled with awareness. It watched, and by watching, it pressed them deeper into the margins. They still survived, but no longer with confidence. Now even their whispers felt loud. 30,000 years ago, they tried to live together, not in passing clusters or wandering pairs, but in a place meant to last. On a shelf of rock overlooking a narrow gorge, near a stream that ran even in dry seasons, they built a settlement, not of walls, but of presence. 16 adults, 5 children, 2 elders. They stacked stone into semicircles, laid woven mats over openings, carved out shelves in the soft interior walls. They dug storage pits lined with bark and cold moss. They placed bones in patterns around their perimeter, not to scare, but to signal. This place is taken. There was food, water, shelter, space to stand. For the first time in memory, they lived not just for movement, but for rest. At night, the fires were dim but steady. Children played in morning mist. Elders spoke in low rhythm by habit, not by urgency. It was not peace, but it was something near it. The knowledge that had once been scattered between moving groups gathered here. One woman knew how to smoke meat using red ash. One man could tie 7 different knots, each for a different weight. One elder knew how to mimic the call of a scavenger bird, not for hunting, but to send a message across the gorge without words. They traded gestures, touches, sounds. They took turns guarding the edge. They watched the sky, measured wind, noticed the patterns in bird migration. The walls were improved, layered in clay, braced with branches. Entrances were hidden behind collapsible brush. They were cautious, but no longer afraid every minute. When a child fell and cried out, no one froze. They looked, they soothed, they moved on. For the first time in hundreds of generations, they weren't just surviving the moment. They were beginning to plan for more than one season. Then came the night. No scream was heard. No sign was left. Sentries who had watched for years saw nothing, or never had time to see. The attack came not with thunder, but with precision. Claws that left no prints. Shadows that understood silence. By the time the sun broke the edge of the gorge, the smoke had stopped rising. The walls had been pulled down, not broken, quietly, piece by piece. The fires had been smothered with moss, not scattered. The stores were not stolen, but left open and rotting, and every body was gone. Not one was found, not a drop of blood, not a dragged limb. Only impressions in the mud, dozens of them leading out in a spiral. It was not a massacre. It was something worse. A removal, an erasure, a message spoken in the only language the new predators used. Observation, precision, control. The neighboring groups did not search for survivors. They did not visit the site. They did not speak of it aloud. The gorge was marked with stones in a shape that had no other meaning, a circle with no center. Avoid, forget, move on. The idea of settlement died with the community that built it. For generations afterward, no one tried again. Caves were revisited, but only for sleep. Shared meals happened, but never in the same place twice. Children were taught not only silence, but impermanence. If it can be seen, it can be followed. If it can be followed, it can be ended. These became truths, as fixed as the cold. The memory of that small, bright effort faded, not because they forgot, but because they could not afford to remember. Togetherness was no longer a hope, it was a risk, and from that night forward, they chose to scatter, because something else had learned how to find what they built. 20,000 years ago, they began to give names to what they feared. Not spoken names, not written, but passed through gesture, through rhythm, through the slow repetition of ideas that shaped the way they moved, ate, slept. Stories emerged, not for comfort, but for warning. In the cold spaces between settlements, in the deep hours before dawn, they taught their children about the ones who ruled the land long before them. Beings with scales that could not be pierced, with eyes that saw through rock, with voices that never shouted but still silenced whole families. These were not ancestors. These were not spirits. They were gods only in the sense that they could not be stopped. And so they became sacred, not in reverence but in fear. The myths were not about creation. They were about continuation, how to go unseen, how to move without angering the watchers. The gods of the highlands were different from those of the valleys. In the cold mountains, they were imagined with wings of bone and feathers like ash. In the riverlands, they rose from water without splash, with jaws that opened without sound. In the deepest forests, they were only glimpsed as shifting leaves and warm breath on the back of the neck. Some myths described them as ever-present, always nearby, always listening. Others said they only appeared when their names were spoken, which is why no name was ever spoken more than once. Children learned to draw their shapes in dirt and erase them before nightfall. Women carried small stones wrapped in hide, marked with claw-like slashes, not for protection, but as offerings. Men fasted before long travel. Everyone covered their mouths when the wind blew east. These rituals were not questioned. They were repeated, because the ones who didn't repeat them often didn't return. Prayer was not directed upward. There were no skies to lift hands to. The heavens belonged to wings. Instead, their prayers were downward, inward, muttered with heads low, bodies still, breath held. They prayed for silence, for shadows, for snow to fall thicker, for wind to change direction, for the predators to be sated elsewhere. There were no songs, only hums without melody, often passed from one person to another through gentle vibration on the skin. The old would place their hands on the chests of the young and teach them to breathe in rhythm with the earth. "Stay below the sound," they would whisper. "The gods are listening." The myths were not there to explain the world. They were there to survive it. And in a world where intelligence could be fatal, belief became another kind of tool, one that shaped behavior, one that kept them small. In time, entire regions developed their own patterns of reverence. Some scratched circles in cave walls, always incomplete. Others placed bones in spiral patterns near sleeping sites, never returning to the same spiral twice. A few painted red lines across their faces before hunting, as if to confuse the gaze of a god who might be watching from above. None of this brought protection, but it brought order. And order, in a world ruled by chaos and silence, was a kind of power. It helped them believe there was meaning, even in fear. That there was reason to keep moving, keep hiding, keep whispering. These myths did not offer salvation, only delay. But in an age where every delay meant another night survived, another child born, another memory carried forward, that was enough. The gods were not loved, but they were obeyed, and in that obedience the people endured. 10,000 years ago, they still ate what they could find, not what they could grow. Seeds were known, roots were understood. Some even noticed which plants returned year after year, and where the soil stayed rich after fire or flood. But no one planted in rows. No one cleared a field. The idea of standing still long enough to shape the land into something useful remained unthinkable, not because they lacked the skill, but because the land itself did not belong to them. Open space meant exposure, flat ground meant visibility, and wherever a clearing stretched wide enough to imagine as a field, it already bore the signs of reptilian passage, massive tracks pressed into soft earth, broken branches at feeding height, the faint but unmistakable scent of something that would return soon. To plant in such a place was not ambition, it was invitation, an offering of one's presence to creatures who never forgot what they had once owned. Instead, they followed the cycles of growth in silence. They knew which mosses clung to the warm side of stone, which fungi bloomed after 3 days of rain. They learned which seeds to chew and which to bury inside dried meat to preserve them. But the knowledge was hidden, scattered between small groups, passed hand to hand, never spoken loudly. There were no granaries, no fences. The food they gathered was carried, eaten, cached in caves that could be abandoned without regret. Some had tried, in generations past, to tend small plots. Hollowed soil near cave mouths, scattered pits behind stone walls. But every time the growth became too visible, too green, too full, too still, something came. Not always seen, not always heard, but the result was the same. A trampled pit, a trail of feathers, a silence that pressed against the lungs. After enough losses, they stopped trying. Even the word ownership, if it existed, would have sounded like a mistake. The land was not theirs to divide. It was a place to pass through, to pause beside, to remember. Some communities kept maps scratched onto flat bones, tracking where wild tubers flourished or where fruit fell in patterns. But none of these places were returned to at regular intervals. The giants, the older predators, still followed their own migrations, and their schedules were never predictable. The smaller reptilian hunters, those with thought behind their eyes, seemed to anticipate human roots. To build permanence in such a world was to give your scent a location, to give your death a calendar. So they moved, quietly, always. The food was gathered, not stored. The hunger delayed, never banished. They did not sow because to sow was to settle, and to settle was to be seen. And so 10,000 years after fire and language and walls, they still lived by the rhythms of fear. Agriculture was not a dream denied. It was a dream dismissed, irrelevant in a world where the cost of being noticed outweighed any harvest. The fields belonged to the reptiles because the fields were open, because the reptiles were faster, because the humans had learned that mastery of land meant nothing if you did not first master the art of vanishing. And they had. Their survival was not failure. It was calculation. But it came with a price. The world did not remember them. The land bore no mark of their presence. They existed like wind in the trees, passing, whispering, gone. And whatever they might have built remained unbuilt. Not because they were incapable, but because the earth they walked on still belonged to something else. 8,000 years ago, the cold returned. Not in a single winter, but in a slow, creeping shift that pressed glaciers downward and pulled tree lines back into the earth. The world did not freeze all at once, but it tightened. Rivers shrank, rainfall weakened, and the great green jungles that had long hidden the giants began to shrink. With them, the largest predators began to retreat, slowly, stubbornly, searching for warmth that no longer came. Some vanished. Others moved south. A few adapted, but even they grew less certain in their rule. For the first time in memory, the world felt less crowded. Not safe. Never safe, but thinner. Emptier. The skies above the forests were quieter. The deep trails through valleys stayed undisturbed longer. And into those gaps the people began to move. Not boldly, not publicly, but with something that almost resembled purpose. They stayed longer in certain places, built deeper shelters into the sides of frozen hills, covered cave entrances with snow and dried moss to hold heat. In the highlands, they learned how to trap wind between stone corridors to preserve warmth. Some carved runes into bone, not just to mark death or danger, but to remember a path, a place, a method that had worked once before. They still moved, but less often. The air gave them more time. The predators, less driven by hunger, grew slower in their pursuit. The humans began to sleep in shifts that felt like rhythms instead of defense. They gathered at certain rock faces where the sun fell just right in late winter. Not to prey, to dry meat, to stitch together longer coats, to swap knowledge that could not be shouted, could not be recorded, but still mattered. Stone was touched more often now, still not broken, but handled, considered, used to crack, to grind, to smooth. For a brief time, fire returned. Not everywhere, not without caution, but in places where snow buried the smoke and ice masked the scent. Fires burned low, hidden in carved pits, fed by bones and dried fungus instead of wood that snapped too loudly. Around these fires, stories began to change. They no longer spoke only of the gods with claws or the rules of silence. They spoke of techniques, of patterns in the snow, of stars that marked the beginning of the safe moon, of tools that worked better in frozen soil. The young listened differently. They asked, even if only with a glance. The old taught, even if only with a touch. There were still disappearances, still tracks found too close, still moments when the forest exhaled the kind of quiet that meant something had begun to hunt. But they came less often, and in the spaces between, the people remembered more than fear. Progress did not look like stone cities or written language. It looked like a basket that didn't fall apart in rain, a sling that could carry a child across a frozen ridge, a trap that used snow's weight instead of tension. They were small things, but they stayed, and staying in this world was power. The cold was not kind. It stole fingers, closed throats, buried the weak. But it took more from the reptiles than it did from the humans. And in that imbalance, the people found a thin ledge to stand on. They didn't climb higher, but they stopped falling. They still spoke in whispers, still moved at night, still taught children that silence was survival. But for a short span of time, the world did not feel entirely against them. And in that thin pause, they stepped forward. Not far, but forward. 6,000 years ago, they brought fire back, not as a desperate spark scraped from stone, but as a patient, steady companion. The long winters of the cold age had taught them to listen differently, to read wind not just by sound, but by temperature, to see danger not just by movement, but by absence. And so, when the glaciers began to recede and the lowlands softened once again, they carried embers with them. Wrapped in thick moss, tucked into hollow bones, fed by careful breath, these embers followed families from cave to cave, hill to hill. The fires they built were not large, not open, but they burned longer than before, deeper, covered by stone circles or hidden in pits under the earth. They boiled water, dried meat, let children sleep warm. For a time, it felt like the beginning of something new, not bold, not loud, but sustained. They had earned this warmth, and they believed quietly that perhaps they had also earned the right to keep it. But light travels, smoke clings, heat leaves a signature, and the world had not forgotten them. Long after they had abandoned the old settlements, after they had scattered to survive, something had watched them from the tree line, from the cliffs, from the edge of memory. The observers returned slowly, without sound, without tracks. One night a trap was found reset, carefully, precisely, but using the wrong bait. Another, a child's sleeping place, was discovered covered in feathers, clean, dry, arranged in a circle. No one saw the creatures directly, but they felt the shift. Fires that once lasted the night began to feel exposed after dusk. The air near certain valleys grew thick again, not with mist, but with attention. The fire did not betray them in an instant. It lured something back that had only been waiting for the invitation. The signs were too subtle at first to be understood. Small piles of stones rearranged, bone tools missing, then returned sharpened, patterns in dirt that mimicked human footprints, but with toes too long, steps too even. Someone began marking the trees in ways no one in the group remembered teaching. The language of gesture, the low murmurs and coded movement that had defined their communication for thousands of years, grew quiet again, not from forgetting, but from fear. The children asked fewer questions. The elders stopped teaching with voice. Firelight became smaller, more carefully tended. Some groups buried their coals before dawn, refusing to let any spark live past the safety of night. And others, those who didn't adjust quickly enough, simply vanished. No blood, no sound, just silence. A place once warm, now still, and no one returned to gather the remains. They did not give up the fire again, not fully. It had come too far with them. It had healed too much. But it changed shape. No longer comfort. It became signal again. A tool, not a companion. Something to be hidden more than used. They learned to burn dry moss for heat without smoke, to feed the flame beneath layers of bark that glowed but didn't flare, to carry warmth in stone instead of flame. It was not the age of fire. It was its negotiation, a balance between need and exposure, between hope and the memory of claws in the dark. And though they never saw the observers clearly, never captured one, never named them, they knew. Fire had called them. And once again, the world reminded them, nothing bright survives long in the open. So they stayed low, they stayed watchful, and the fire burned, faint, steady, afraid. 5,000 years ago, the first threads of civilization began to weave themselves through the stone, not in valleys, not along rivers, not in any of the places where cities would one day rise in another version of history, but deep in the mountains, buried within caves that opened like wounds in the earth. There, in pockets of warmth shielded by distance and darkness, small groups began to live not just from moment to moment, but from season to season. They built platforms of woven roots to sleep above the cold. They carved channels to divert meltwater through their shelters. They created caches of dried food, not just for winter, but for the idea of tomorrow. The spaces grew layered, one corner for sleeping, one for tools, one for the soft rituals of teaching and tending. They were not towns, not yet. But they were more than camps, places people left, but always came back to. Fear shaped everything. Entrances were disguised with stones balanced to fall loudly if disturbed. Fires burned behind angled walls of damp clay, their light reflected rather than revealed. Pathways between caves were never straight. Roots changed with the wind, with animal movement, with memory. Groups rarely grew beyond 20. When they did, they split, not from conflict, but from caution. Noise was rationed like food. Songs were not sung. Laughter was shared with covered mouths. But even in that fear, something new took root, a sense of place, of belonging. Certain caves held carvings too old to explain, marks not of language but of presence. A row of vertical lines, a handprint with a missing finger, spirals etched where no light reached. No one claimed these marks, but they were respected, cleaned, protected. A kind of memory made into shelter. Trade returned, not with markets or currencies, but with quiet exchange. One cave system passed along a sharpened shell that could slice wet bark cleanly. Another offered powdered roots that dulled pain. The travelers moved at night, never twice the same way, carrying goods in silent bundles wrapped tight against their skin. They spoke in signs, not voices. When they arrived, they were fed without questions. When they left, their path was blessed with smoothed stones, stacked just so to confuse any creature that might follow. These exchanges brought more than objects. They brought stories. The memory of a new tool, a different method of binding, a way to keep mold from spreading across stored meat. Knowledge moved, slowly, carefully, but it moved. And in its movement, the scattered pieces of humanity began to feel less alone. This was not a golden age. It was not even a beginning. It was survival, stretched thin across distance and fear. But it held shape. It endured. And that alone was a kind of civilization, small, trembling, embedded in rock, but real. The outside world still belonged to the old predators. Their calls still echoed in the canyons. Their eyes still gleamed from the treetops. But for the first time in generations, people had more than memory to pass on. They had structure. They had time. They had places to return to and reasons to return. They were not safe, but they were not entirely lost. Civilization, such as it was, did not rise like smoke. It burrowed like roots, deep and hidden, waiting for a world that might one day allow it to grow in the open. Until then, it remained underground, alive, quiet, watching. 4,000 years ago, narrow lines began to stretch across the mountains. Not roads in the way other histories would know them. There was no stone, no wheel, no open travel, but thin, shifting paths, carved by footsteps and memory, linking one hidden shelter to another. They crossed ridges only under moonlight, hugged canyon walls where echo was absorbed by moss, dipped into valleys where fog lingered late into the morning. These were not paths for migration. They were for trade, simple, essential, quiet. People carried what they had: dried roots wrapped in skin, sharp bone needles, hard resin that burned without smoke. They moved in pairs, never more, always barefoot, always silent. Each step was planned, each resting place known in advance. Some routes took days, some took weeks. None of them were safe. Travel happened only at night. The rules were absolute. No fire, no talking, no stopping on exposed ground. Every trader knew how to read the wind by scent, how to crouch flat when hearing distant wings, how to press themselves into rock and vanish for hours. They wore no color. They left no signs. When they arrived, they did not announce themselves. They were expected. A stone placed near a cave entrance. A stack of 3 sticks leaned against a tree. These were the signals. If the signal was wrong, they left. If it was absent, they waited until dawn, then turned back. The risk was too great to question. Too many had vanished, trying to deliver too much or stay too long. The ones who survived did so because they understood that the route was not theirs. They were guests in a space older and more dangerous than memory. Still, the paths grew. Wordless agreements formed between caves separated by impossible terrain. This cave would send meat in spring. That one would provide tools shaped from volcanic glass gathered near a distant ridge. Another had access to bitter leaves that dulled hunger and pain. These exchanges were not bartered face to face. They were left in sealed baskets, wrapped in oilskin, traded during sleep or silence. There was no negotiation, no theft. If a basket was found emptied but not replaced, it was understood to be a warning, not from the traders, but from the world itself. Everyone remembered the old rule. If something disappears without sound, follow it and you disappear too. So they obeyed the quiet order of things. In this fragile system, trust was not earned. It was presumed and never questioned. These primitive trade routes did not bring prosperity. They brought endurance. Small advantages shared slowly across distance. One family now knew how to store meat underground so it wouldn't rot in spring. Another learned how to make pitch that held bone together through snow. A child far away wore a necklace made of shell from a coastline they had never seen. These were not luxuries. They were links. Proof that others lived. That the human world, broken and scattered and buried in fear, still had veins that pulsed beneath the surface. They never met in great numbers, never gathered in daylight. But they moved, at night, from point to point, through a map no predator could read. And that movement, deliberate, dangerous, and invisible, was enough to call a network. A civilization that refused to stand still, because stillness was death. But movement, even whispered, meant there was still a future. 3,000 years ago, they began to leave marks not for memory, but for warning. These were not letters, not part of any system that could spell a name or record a story. They were symbols, carved into stone, scratched into bark, pressed into soft clay that later hardened by accident. They weren't placed to be seen by all. They were meant for those who knew what to look for. A spiral etched low to the ground meant a predator's nest nearby. A series of 3 vertical slashes meant the water had turned. An open circle broken on one side warned of a path watched too often by something that didn't leave tracks. These symbols didn't explain. They did not invite interpretation. They simply said, stop, turn, hide. They were placed without ceremony, often at night, usually by the eldest of the group. Those who carved them did so alone, without witness, as if sharing the knowledge too loudly might wake what it was meant to keep away. The earliest symbols were simple, but their placement gave them weight. One tribe used a downward-pointing triangle to mark caves that had been abandoned after disappearances. Another carved rows of short horizontal lines into stones near narrow passes. A count, perhaps, of how many had gone through, or how many had not returned. There were marks meant only for touch, hidden behind hanging moss, or carved on the underside of overhangs. Travelers felt for them in the dark with their fingers. If the surface was smooth, they passed through. If the grooves were fresh, they turned back. These signs spread along the trade routes, unspoken agreements forming between distant groups about what each shape meant. There was no central origin, no inventor. The symbols emerged like fungus, spontaneously, in shadow, everywhere at once. These markings became their only shared language, but it was not used to build. It was used to avoid. They did not write to remember joy or to praise their gods. They wrote to stay alive. A line through a circle meant a path had collapsed. A jagged stroke over a faded symbol meant the old warning no longer applied. Either the danger had passed, or something worse had taken its place. When a cave was sealed, the final act was to carve a mark just above its entrance, one that would survive longer than memory. No one taught the meanings aloud. Children were shown by example, led to the symbols, made to trace them, told a story not of origin, but of consequence. This is where they were taken. This is where the sky never answers. This is where silence did not save us. And so, long before they had cities or names, before they gathered in daylight or shaped clay into vessels, they learned to write with fear. These early writings were not declarations of thought, but instructions for erasure. How to disappear correctly, how to warn without being noticed, how to pass through a world that still did not want them. In time, the marks became layered, old signs beneath new ones, contradictions left unresolved, stories buried in overlapping grooves. But no one cleared them away. Every symbol mattered, even when misunderstood, because any one of them could be the difference between continuing and vanishing. Their writing, such as it was, grew from the earth like their shelters, small, hidden, essential. And though no one called it writing then, it was the beginning of something permanent, a record not of what they were, but of what they feared. And in that fear, they endured. 2,000 years ago, the creatures that would later become myths in other worlds still walked these forests, climbed these cliffs, swam through dark, wide rivers. They were not legends. They were not imagined. They left feathers tangled in bramble, claw prints deep in stone, bones too large to belong to any memory. In this world, they never vanished. They aged, they evolved. Some grew leaner, others smaller, but none of them disappeared. The massive, scaled beasts with eyes like polished amber, the long-limbed flyers with quiet wings and curved jaws, the amphibious watchers that moved without sound just beneath the water's skin. All of them still existed, and people knew them not as stories but as neighbors, unpredictable, dangerous, present. There was no debate about whether they had ever been real. There was only the question of whether they were near. The people did not worship them. Worship implies distance, ritual, mystery. These creatures were none of that. They were real, immediate, and mostly uninterested in negotiation. Some avoided contact altogether. Others circled human settlements with regular curiosity. They never spoke, but their movement told its own story. A sudden absence of birds, a shift in the direction of wind, the silence of frogs. Signs that were read like scripture. Children learned to interpret them before they could walk upright. A feather too large, too smooth, too perfectly curled on the path meant change. Scattered stones that hadn't been there the night before meant the valley was no longer safe. The people didn't ask why. They accepted, adjusted, moved. The rules were older than memory and not meant to be challenged. And yet, despite the danger, some creatures were followed. From a distance, quietly. A certain species that moved in pairs, never hunting, only watching, became known for its tendency to reappear. Always near places where humans had recently abandoned fire. Always after night. These beings, with narrow necks and eyes that reflected no light, began to appear in the earliest carvings, not as threats, but as omens. Some believed they were messengers. Others thought they were a punishment. Either way, their presence shaped behavior. No one stayed in one place for too long after seeing one. No one spoke about it directly. They called it the cold that watches. Other creatures inspired different responses. One large, slow-moving species covered in bone-like plates was treated with reverence, not because it helped or harmed, but because it seemed to remember. It returned to the same paths, left the same deep trails. It ignored humans completely. Its indifference was a kind of mercy. Over time, these creatures became woven into every part of life. They appeared in the warning symbols, in bone carvings, in dreams that elders whispered to each other, but never to the young. They dictated migration patterns. They shaped architecture. A cave entrance never faced the direction where the long-necked flyers hunted. Cooking fires were placed near the dens of smaller, less intelligent reptiles, not for safety, but because those creatures kept larger ones away. People lived not in reaction to myth, but in choreography with something real. What others would later call dragons or monsters or spirits were, in this world, simply facts. Lived facts, their shapes carved into walls not to decorate, but to teach. Their voices not chanted in ritual, but feared in the stillness before dawn. In this timeline, myth never had a chance to form. There was no room for imagination, only survival. Only knowledge passed from those who had seen to those who must never forget. 1,000 years ago, the first true cities were carved not into land, but into the darkness beneath it. They were not cities in the way the word might be understood elsewhere. There were no towers, no plazas, no walls to defend from invaders. These were not centers of trade or celebration. They were clusters of tunnels, domes, and shafts spiraling downward, hidden so far below the surface that no light ever reached them. Their ceilings wept with condensation. Their floors were polished by generations of bare feet. The air was heavy, warm, still. Silence was not only a rule, it was structural. Every voice, every movement, every shared breath was measured. The deeper one lived, the longer one survived. In the shallows near the surface, the scent of smoke or sweat might rise and betray everything. These underground cities formed slowly. Over centuries, cave systems once used for sleeping or storing became central points. One tunnel led to another. One family taught another how to reinforce a wall with woven root. A dome cracked by tremor was filled and forgotten. Another was dug twice as deep. Over time, rooms became chambers. Chambers became networks. Entire generations lived and died without ever seeing the sky. Paths were marked by scent and sound. Braided ropes knotted in specific sequences. Carved ridges that hands could follow in the dark. Small bells that rang only when touched a certain way. Light was precious and rare. Lichens scraped from high caverns. Tiny worms that pulsed with dim blue glow. Resin that burned without flame but filled the tunnels with sour smoke. These were gathered carefully and used only when absolutely necessary. Most learned to live with shadow. Children were taught not to fear it, but to feel through it. To hear the way stone breathes. To know when silence is wrong. Rules were strict. Fire could not be made below a certain depth. Tools were to be bound in cloth when carried. Movement was staggered. Never more than one group walking a tunnel at a time. Echo was a threat. Even stone could betray. And always, someone listened. Not for words, but for changes. The shift of air pressure that meant a passage had collapsed. The low, rhythmic thud that meant something above had started to move. Stories spread of whole levels gone silent in a single night. Of markings scraped away from warning walls. Of tunnels suddenly colder than stone should be. These stories were not told to frighten. They were reminders. The cities did not belong to those who dug them. They were trespasses, tolerated only as long as their makers remembered how small they were. The surface still pulsed with danger. Every descent was a negotiation, every expansion a risk. And yet, these cities endured. Some grew to span miles underground. They housed knowledge, of roots that fed without light, of stone that sang when near collapse, of creatures that sometimes appeared and sometimes disappeared, leaving no trace but a scent of copper. They housed memory, carved into the walls as rows of dots, as winding spirals, as hollowed-out bones hung in doorways. They even housed governance, if it could be called that. Elders who knew the old paths, who remembered which tunnels had never been re-entered, who held the names of places not to be spoken aloud. There was no hierarchy, only trust. Trust in the deep, trust in the dark. Trust that this fragile, hidden world might continue a little longer. Above them, the world belonged to teeth and wing and shadow. But below, here in the stone, they had made a place not of safety, but of structure. And in a world that never forgot them, that structure was the closest thing they had to freedom. 500 years ago, a group emerged from the deep places. They were not larger than others, not stronger, but they were louder, first in words, then in footsteps. Stories say they came from a region where the tunnels grew wide, where light from the surface could still be glimpsed through cracks in the stone. They had not forgotten the sky, and in time they began to believe that the world above could be taken back. They spoke of reclaiming land, of standing tall, of confronting the ones who had ruled in silence for longer than memory. They carved weapons from horn and hardened root. They painted symbols not to warn, but to challenge. They sang softly at first, then louder, then without fear. The other cities heard them through the stone. Not the words, but the echo. The unnatural rhythm of a group that had decided the old rules no longer mattered. Their movement was brief, but not hidden. Scouts from nearby settlements saw the signs. Tunnels widened. Refuse left behind in haste. Walls freshly scraped where no one had scraped in generations. Even the air changed, thinner, faster moving, disturbed. One day, the group simply vanished. They left the tunnels behind, ascended through narrow vents and collapsed stairwells, through shafts that hadn't been used in hundreds of years. No one knows how far they got, only that they went up. Some say they reached the surface and lit fires in the open, that they marched together, barefaced, carrying torches that blazed orange against the blue of a cold morning. Others say they never reached the light, that something met them halfway and turned them to ash before their feet ever touched open ground. There are no remains, no broken tools, no scraps of fabric or bone, only the silence that followed. The silence lasted longer than anyone expected. Not just the quiet of a group gone missing, but something deeper. The tunnels around their region grew cold. Sound didn't travel the same way. Birds stopped nesting near the vents. Roots once harvested for warmth began to rot. Travelers passing nearby reported dreams of great pressure. Not fear, not pain, just pressure. Like the feeling of being watched from beneath the earth instead of above. In some places, symbols appeared that no one had carved. Not in the old language, not in any known shape. They were smooth, deliberate, set deep into the walls, marks that couldn't be erased. Elders told their people not to look at them too long. Children were kept away. And in every city, the same phrase began to be whispered again. Let them forget us. No one speaks the names of that group anymore. If they had a name, it's gone now, scraped clean. Their city was sealed. Its tunnels collapsed, its records burned. Some say the collapse was deliberate, carried out by their own people to keep whatever followed from reaching deeper. Others believe it wasn't a collapse at all, that the stone itself closed over them, tired of being carved, tired of being defied. What matters is that they are gone, not defeated in battle, not conquered, gone, erased not as punishment, but as warning. A reminder that war in this world is not declared. It is invited. And the ones you invite do not negotiate, so the rest stayed quiet. The rest stayed deep. And even now, 5 centuries later, No one walks the old passages, not because they are afraid of what happened, but because they fear what listened. 300 years ago, they began to keep track. Not of days, they had long since given up on counting those. Not of victories, there were none to speak of. What they began to record was simply this: survival. Which families had lasted through the cold season? Which tunnels remained safe? Which foods did not spoil? Which routes were abandoned and why? It wasn't called history at first. It was just a chain of memory, passed from mouth to mouth, from wall to wall. But slowly, patterns formed, symbols repeated. One mark for flood, another for collapse, a third for a disappearance that had no cause. And from that pattern, something emerged. Not a story of triumph, but a timeline of endurance. They called it the long map. Not because it led anywhere, but because it stretched backward farther than anyone could walk. The long map was not a scroll, not a book. It was scattered, etched into the walls of sleeping chambers, painted in streaks of ash near entrances, woven into cloth that was worn thin with years of handling. Each community had its own pieces. Some overlapped, others contradicted. But all were treated with the same careful reverence. Children were taught to read them before they were taught to speak fluently. Reading meant survival. Reading meant context. If a tunnel had been marked with the spiral of echoes, no one used it, even if it looked stable. If a food route was labeled with a red branch, it meant sickness once followed it. The records did not ask why. They only showed what had happened. That was enough. Over time, the idea of history grew heavier. It was no longer just what happened. It became who they were. A people without territory, without power, without monuments, but not without memory. Their ancestors had not shaped empires. They had not carved their names into mountains, but they had endured, and now that endurance was preserved, not celebrated, preserved. Stories began to change. Old tales of creatures and gods were rewritten in the language of record. The myth of the long-eyed watcher became a notation. Seen near surface vent, moonless night, 3 missing. The legend of the blue flame was filed beside accounts of a collapsing resin cache. History became a tool, not a comfort. Its purpose was not pride. It was preparation. By the end of that century, there were people who dedicated themselves to the long map entirely. They didn't teach, didn't lead, didn't fight. They remembered. Their skin was marked with sequences. Their breath was slow and shallow, trained to measure time. They could trace a tunnel's history by scent alone. And when they spoke, people listened, not out of reverence, but because forgetting was dangerous. Forgetting meant stepping in the wrong place, speaking at the wrong moment, using fire where silence was required. History, in this world, was not written to inspire. It was written to reduce risk. And even now, in the deepest chambers, under layers of soot and dust, there are still fingers tracing the lines, still eyes scanning the stone for patterns, still people trying to remember how not to vanish. 200 years ago, they began to draw maps. Not the old kind, not the long map of memory and survival etched in charcoal and oil. These were something else. Attempts to describe the world beyond necessity. It started small, as everything did. One settlement sent 2 scouts farther than they had dared in decades. They returned not with stories, but with measurements. The width of a fissure, the depth of a tunnel, the direction of wind currents in abandoned shafts. Their tools were primitive: tied bones, soot ink, pressed bark, but the intent was clear. Not exploration for conquest, not curiosity for its own sake. Just a need to understand the outlines of their prison. A map not to dream, but to warn. The maps that followed were never drawn in public. They were assembled in secret corners by those with the patience to listen to rock and the caution not to speak of what they learned. Each new section was reviewed in silence, with fingers tracing the curves instead of voices naming them. Certain lines were jagged, indicating dangerous resonance zones. Others were faint and dotted, meaning unstable, likely to shift. If a map included the symbol for breathless air, it was sealed and filed. No one walked a route if the air had once taken someone. Still, over years, the maps grew. Small tunnels became networks. Unknown regions gained names, quiet ones. Some maps were destroyed as soon as they were made, if the discovery was too strange, too risky to be remembered. Mapping was not a triumph. It was a ritual of careful failure. Eventually, the idea of mapping spread. Cities that had once ignored each other began exchanging fragments. One group might send a pattern of ridges they believed connected to another's lost vent. Another might confirm it, or warn against it. This exchange was done without speech. Strings of bone were passed hand to hand. No one wanted to take credit. Names were not attached. If something proved useful, it was kept. If not, it was buried, sometimes literally. In rare cases, routes were shared that led briefly above ground, under cloud or moon, where the air smelled different and the silence buzzed. These were never copied, only walked once, then forgotten on purpose. A map that drew too much attention could become an invitation. No one wanted to be found drawing the wrong line. And yet, the maps survived. Some were painted in wax and soot inside hollowed bones. Others were carved into the underside of sleeping slabs. One was said to be tattooed entirely across the back of a dying elder who refused to lie down. These maps weren't hopeful. They didn't show treasure or home or promise. They showed where things had not yet gone wrong, where silence had held, where stone had not betrayed. That was the closest they could get to optimism. A dark path that might stay dark, a wall that hadn't yet crumbled, a tunnel where no sound had echoed back. These were the places worth marking. And as the years passed and more maps were made, they slowly built not a sense of freedom, but a shape. A rough shape of the world they still didn't belong to, but had learned, just barely, how to endure. 100 years ago, the first machines came to life, not with a roar, not with sparks, but with a slow hum barely louder than breath. They weren't built for glory or innovation. They were built because hands, even skilled ones, could no longer bear the strain. The tunnels had deepened. The burden of carrying supplies, grinding roots, shaping bone, it had grown too heavy. And so they made the machines small, flat, cautious. Some ran on gravity, rolling down slopes and pulled back up by silence-driven cranks. Others were powered by heat stored in stone jars, carefully released through coils of scavenged metal. None glowed, none blinked. If a machine made noise, it was dismantled before it finished its task. Safety lay in stillness. The people didn't call them machines at first. They called them extensions of need, of limitation, of fatigue. The earliest ones had no names. They weren't celebrated. When they worked, they were hidden. When they failed, they were buried. One was designed to scrape moss off the ceilings of deep tunnels where climbing was too dangerous. It moved slow enough not to trigger vibrations, and its scraping arm was padded in animal hair to muffle contact. Another could carry loads heavier than 3 adults, crawling along a floor groove etched with soot for guidance. It didn't turn corners. If the path curved, it simply stopped. Instructions were minimal, carved in short lines. Push here. Wait. Listen. No voices were used around them. Whispering was too risky. A single echo could carry upward. With time, the machines became more deliberate. Not more advanced, just more precise. Builders learned which materials didn't crack when stressed, which combinations produced less heat, less smell, less presence. One group designed a wheeled platform that could sense tremors and freeze instantly, like a prey animal feigning death. Another embedded their machines with soft bristles, so they left no trail on the dust-covered stone. Motion had to be clean. Footprints could attract attention. So could warmth. So could rhythm. Every gear, every movement was adjusted to break patterns, to blend in with the irregular breathing of the tunnels themselves. They weren't machines that changed the world. They were machines that tried not to remind the world they existed. And yet, in the deepest chambers, these machines marked a shift. People began to gather around them, not to marvel, but to learn, to adapt. They no longer shaped every tool with bone, no longer carried every weight alone. And though their voices remained quiet, their reach grew. The machines allowed them to reach new regions, to recover lost fragments of the long map, to extract minerals once left buried for fear of noise. Civilization, still hidden, still broken into pockets, stretched a little farther, not upward, not outward, but inward, into the stone. The machines didn't bring power. They brought survival with less suffering. A small gift, traded in silence. Even now, their descendants roll softly along the old grooves, cleaning, carrying, disappearing into shadow, as if they were never there. 50 years ago, they discovered how to harness electricity, not in the way it had once sparked through wires above lost cities, not as a sign of progress or dominance, but as something tentative, controlled, nearly sacred. It began with friction, then heat, then careful coils wrapped around bones of old prey, etched with resin and bound in cloth. The first success was no brighter than a candle, but it didn't flicker. It didn't breathe. It hummed with an unnatural steadiness. That frightened some. Others leaned closer. But everyone agreed on one thing immediately. This was not to be brought to the surface. Electricity, for all its potential, would remain in the dark. They called it whisper light, not because it was quiet, but because it had to be used like a secret. A glow that only the walls were meant to see. The first circuits were carved into the floors, beneath stone panels. They ran for only a few meters. Power storage was crude. Layers of chemicals wrapped in resin, recharged by the heat of living bodies or the slow trickle of underground water. The energy was unstable, prone to bursting if handled wrong. But over time, they learned to moderate it. No sparks, no excess. Just a steady pulse enough to run machines more precisely, to boil water without flame, to send faint pulses through copper threads embedded in the walls. Not for communication, not yet, but for silent signaling. A blink here, a pause there. They called it the new breath. To use electricity above ground was never considered. Even those who had never seen the sky knew the stories. Light above would be seen. Light above would be answered. The watchers, those scaled minds with patience longer than empires, would feel it. The air would shift. The silence would crack. So they buried their wires deeper, wrapped their glow in layers of soot and cloth, and forbade any powered object from passing beyond the last gate. Children were taught not to ask why. Adults were reminded not to forget. And those who doubted only needed to be shown the old scars near the surface, where once, long ago, someone had tried to bring light where it didn't belong. Yet within those boundaries, electricity changed their lives. Machines no longer relied on gravity alone. Medical care became more delicate. They created tools to monitor body heat without touch, to purify fungus before it spoiled. Books, what few had survived, were copied not by hand, but by slow-scanning mirrors powered by breath-fed turbines. Storage caves were cooled in cycles. Gates could now lock and unlock silently from afar. And still, no one celebrated. Electricity was not joy. It was risk, tamed into usefulness. They whispered thanks to it as they passed glowing coils, not because it was divine, but because they feared what it might invite if ever it was misused. Even now, as the soft pulse continues beneath the deepest cities, no one dares raise it skyward. The light is a gift, but only for those who live in the dark. 20 years ago, for the first time in their long and cautious history, they chose not to hide. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't panic. It was a decision made slowly, over the course of a decade, by scattered leaders who had never met each other face to face. They had communicated in flickers, vibrations, the brief flashes of underground signal threads. And when they all finally agreed, the message was prepared. Not for the stars, not for gods, not for any unseen force in the void. It was meant for others like them, survivors, hidden peoples, silent watchers. Whoever had endured, wherever they were, the signal was to reach them. And it would say, "We are here, but this world is not safe." The message was crafted not in words, but in tones. Subsonic pulses woven with ancient patterns. A language no one spoke aloud, but many understood. The machine that would send it took 6 years to build. It was not large, but it had to be precise. Buried deeper than any chamber before it, encased in layers of absorbing stone, the transmitter would only activate once. It would not broadcast again. Repetition meant risk. The signal had to be unmistakable, but it also had to end. Its energy source was sealed in wax and cooled for weeks. One burst, one breath, that was all. Then silence, again, as though nothing had happened. Except that something had. When the day came, the transmission was silent to human ears. No lights blinked. No tremors shook the rock. But those present, engineers, watchers, elders, felt the change in their bones. A deep thrum that passed through their lungs without sound. A pressure. A silence that somehow seemed louder. Then it was gone. And nothing else happened. Not immediately. No great beasts stirred. No tunnels collapsed. For weeks they waited. Months. Nothing came. It was almost disappointing. Then reports began, faint responses impossible to verify. Echoes in the pulse lines. A pattern repeated back, inverted. A pause. Another inversion. Some believed it was nothing. Others believed it was the reply of another underground world, just as terrified, just as careful. No one knew for certain. But even without confirmation, the act itself changed everything. To speak, even once, meant they no longer believed themselves alone, or perhaps that they no longer wished to be. The risk was still enormous. If the scaled ones above had detected it, there would be no warning. But the world had grown tighter. Space had run out, and hope, no matter how fragile, demanded movement. The message was a warning, but it was also an invitation. We are still alive. If you are too, hide. Wait. We are learning how to listen. And though they returned to silence, the memory of that moment stayed. The first time they spoke, not just to survive, but to be heard. Even now, far underground, some still sit near the cold shell of the old transmitter, waiting for an answer they may never receive. Today, you wake up to the scent of damp stone and the faint, metallic taste of filtered air. There is no morning light, because there has never been light. Only the soft, bluish-green glow of the moss-lined tunnel walls and the warm breath of the underground vents that cycle the air. You stretch without rising, feeling the slight movements of others around you, your mate, your children, your quiet community, still curled in silence. The tunnel is narrow but long, carved carefully over generations, reinforced with bone, stone, and silent resolve. Above you, far above, the surface pulses with the danger you were born to avoid. No one speaks of going up. That dream died long before you were born. Your daily routine begins without ceremony. You rise, check the mushroom beds, lined in woven fiber, irrigated by condensation, layered with mulch and ash. These fungi are your sustenance, your medicine, your ink. Each variety glows faintly in a different hue, and you know them all by name, even though names are not spoken aloud anymore. Your hands move with practiced care, checking caps for rot, scraping off invaders, adjusting the shade screens. Some of the younger ones are learning now, fumbling through their first harvests, whispering softly as they mimic you. You let them. Whispering is still allowed, as long as the sounds stay close to the earth. Later, when the warmth from the water vents rises, the children gather in the common hollow. They sit cross-legged in a circle, drawing glyphs in the dust with bone sticks. They are not letters. They are signs, warnings, directions, records of safe paths. The elders say writing came not from curiosity, but necessity, because maps drawn in ash can save lives. There is no word for history in the spoken tongue, only for reminder. You listen to the old woman as she recites from memory the stories passed down, each one a survival, never a triumph. No tales of great victories, no stories of conquest, just episodes of hiding, running, staying quiet. The myths are not about gods who gave fire, but about shadows with claws who took it back. By evening, the tunnel cools, and you gather with your kin folks in the storage chamber, warm from body heat, lit by the soft pulse of the biolamps. You eat together in silence. There is no fire, just a heated stone core, wrapped in insulated moss, slowly warming your foraged meal. Your child asks you, not aloud, but in gesture, "Why do we live here?" You don't answer. Not because you don't know, but because the answer would change nothing. Instead, you trace a simple symbol on their hand, the old mark for safety. Safety in this world is not victory. It is not peace. It is distance, camouflage, breathing without sound, growing without drawing attention, teaching your children not to long for the sky, but to forget that it was ever theirs. That is the legacy you pass on, not freedom, but the art of vanishing. They never left, not really. From the beginning, they were here, massive, scaled, silent in the heat, loud in the dark, patient in ways humans never understood. They didn't need to build monuments or declare dominion over the land. They didn't write laws or raise flags. Their rule was older than language, deeper than memory. Even now, they don't hunt for conquest. They don't need to. The earth still bends to their presence. The trees split for them. The rivers shift around their paths. The wind itself goes quiet when they move. And we, smaller, quicker, louder, have learned to live in their long, heavy shadow. The world has not changed to suit us. We have changed to stay unseen. They are not gods, but they are something older, something that never needed names. You remember when you were young, the first time you saw one. Not fully. Just the curve of a tail through the fog. Or maybe a leg pressing into mud large enough to hold your entire family. The grown-ups didn't scream. They didn't run. They simply became still, like stone, like fossils waiting to be forgotten. That was the lesson you learned. Stillness saves. Stories followed, never from those who got too close, but from those who barely escaped. A neighbor's child vanished. An entire outpost wiped clean in the night. No sounds, no struggle. Just silence and then the smell of blood and heat. Over time, you stopped asking what they wanted. They didn't want. They simply were. They existed as part of the world itself, like gravity, like cold, like hunger. You didn't fight them. You didn't worship them. You built your life around avoiding them. Still, they come. Not often, not every generation, but enough to remind everyone. You might be walking through a trade tunnel and feel a breeze that shouldn't be there. You might hear the rumble of air pushed by a body too large to make sense. Then the lamps go out. The earth shifts, and someone is gone. Entire sections of the underground are sealed forever after an encounter. Roots rerouted, songs rewritten, customs adjusted. It's not hatred. It's accommodation. This is how life continues. Architecture shaped by fear. Language shaped by silence. Technology shaped by hiding. The elders tell you this isn't cowardice. This is wisdom. It is how humans have survived, not by defeating danger, but by folding around it. And so, even now, they rule, not with commands or cruelty, but with presence. Their paths are not mapped, but known. Their habits are not studied, but feared. The surface is theirs, the deep jungle theirs, the ancient valleys theirs. We dig and crawl and whisper beneath their feet. We write poems about the stars, but only read them underground. We invent, but only what does not draw attention. We raise children not to dream big, but to survive long. The world was never taken back. It was never ours to begin with. We are tenants, careful guests in an ancient home that does not belong to us, and in the dark silence of every tunnel, every chamber, every sleep cycle, we remember. This world is still theirs, and we are the ones learning how to live beside them. So now you know. A world where they never left, where survival meant silence, not glory, where history whispered through tunnels, and the sky was never ours. Sleep well tonight, and tomorrow we'll imagine another world.